Hello everyone. Hope you are able to hear me. We are going to start our webinar in just 1 minute. Hi everyone. Welcome to Krystelis Webinar. We are going to present on 1 year of CTIS, experiences, learning, and a perspective of large and small pharma sponsors and service providers. So during this webinar, if you have any questions, just please use the chat function and write to us. We would make it possible to answer all the questions that we receive. If not, we would be writing to you and collecting the questions later as well. Thank you. I will be introducing our speakers to you. So first, let me share the agenda with you. So we would be introducing the speakers. First, it would be Matthias session, who would be speaking the perspective from small pharma sponsors. Then we would be moving on best practices for a successful transition of trials from EU CTD to EU CTR, learnings from a large pharma sponsor that would be taken by Rekel. And then I'll be speaking and sharing my perspective as a service provider for sponsors on EU CTIS and reduction and minimization activities for CTIS. Thank you. So let me first introduce our speakers to you. So Matthias is a lead expert clinical trial disclosure and R&D processes at Merck Therapeutics, located in Frankfurt, Germany. In this role, he coordinates and oversees all clinical trial disclosure activities, including registration and result submissions. He is also involved in a wide range of organizational and process-related projects at Merck Therapeutics, such as preparing for the EU CTR. He is a biologist by training and has more than 15 years of global experience in the clinical research arena. Our second speaker is Rekel Vakir Paris. She is leading Bristol Myers Squibb preparation for the successful adoption of the EU clinical trial regulation. In this role, Rekel is driving the reshaping of the company to align with the new processes and requirements, the building of the internal training, and heading the change management activities. Rekel started her experience in clinical trials with performing health authorities and ethics committee submissions in the European region at small, medium-sized CROs, followed by 5 years at BMS Global Clinical Trial Submission Unit. Rekel holds an MS in chemistry and worked 9 years at major silicon manufacturer, where she earned her project management skills. Lastly, that's me, Shalini. So I lead medical writing and clinical trial disclosure team at Krystelis. I have about 17 years of experience in medical writing and clinical trial disclosures. I lead medical writing functions, and I also support reduction and minimization activities at Krystelis. Thank you so much. Matthias, over to you.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Matthias, and I will share our experiences of how we prepared for the clinical trial regulation and our first submission of a study that got approved just 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this will be the topic and the learnings and experiences from this undertaking. This will be my topic for the next couple of minutes. Next slide. I will start off with how we prepared for the clinical trial regulation. We started when the regulation came out back in 2015 with a gap analysis firstly, and then we eventually passed it for several years, and 1.5 years prior to the regulation becoming effective, we restarted our preparational work. and then did all the changes that were needed on SOPs, document templates, and also in the organizational setup in our organization. My recommendation here, or the experience lessons learned here, is don't underestimate the resource needs for this activity. Obviously, if you have less time, then you need to invest more time per week or per month. The way we did it allowed us to have this, an ongoing activity over this period of time, 18 months overall, and it's still not completed because activities that will only take place once a study is completed. For example, we are still in the process of developing and implementing, and the same goes for templates. Our overall approach was to keep it as lean and flexible as possible. Being a small organization, I mean, that's what we need to do, basically. And we also got support and buy-in from our line managers that we will learn and develop processes and templates as we are doing things. So not everything had to be final before we actually started the submission. And this also goes in parallel with the fact that guidances and details from outside are coming in and are still coming in. New guidances are popping up, and others are changed or are modified. So it's a bit like a moving target, and that's another reason why you cannot afford to wait until everything is final. You need to start doing things, and then adapt and adopt as you walk along, as you walk on. Leveraging advantages of being a small organization, that was key for us. We have the advantage of having only a few people involved and less politics involved, and this both means that we need less time to develop and implement changes, both at a template level as well as also on the process level and organizational level. What we realized, especially now with our first submission, preparing our first submission, that there's many details along the way where trial team members have to take decisions. And although it may only be smaller details, the impact of those decisions are larger than what people are used to from conducting trials under the directive. And that's a learning that we need to come to a situation where more people than in the past need to understand the full picture in order to make good and informed decisions. That's a key learning, actually. And the same goes actually for the CRO. I will come to this in a minute. We also will need, and that's also a learning that I'm going to feed back into our organization once in the next months. We need to maybe relook at balancing team empowerment versus input from subject matter expert and line managers in the context of, if we decide to answer an RFI, for example, in the past, people just did whatever was requested in order to get the submission approved. Nowadays, we have the situation that most or all of what we submit is going to be public. So there's another angle to look at such decisions. Should we really do this, or should we push back, etc.? Next slide. Our approach to redactions and the challenges related to redaction. So our approach is that we decided for large key documents like protocols or investigator brochures that we have anyone involved in authoring, reviewing, and approving such documents would also have the responsibility to identify potential CCI. So we are making this an integral part of the document creation itself, not an add-on after finalization of the document. for practical reasons, we call this prospective redaction. So the outcome of this procedure is that the final approved document has the markings for what needs to be redacted later afterwards. All the other documents, we have a centralized redaction approach, and only if for those documents that do not contain CCI, i.e., which might only have PPD, we do not foresee an internal approval. So it's just people are trying to do this. There's a QC step involved, but there's no formal approval of these redacted versions. And that's a decision we took for our first study, that we asked the CRO to do the redactions of Part 2 documents. Process challenges. Adhering to a process, a redaction process, even if it's a lean process, takes extra time. So there's also some expectation management to be done within the organization. You need extra time and extra resources. That's for sure. And you need to understand, you need to ensure or establish awareness of why this is important, to do it the way it's defined in working instructions or SOPs, because this will eventually make it more likely that people will really adhere to what's been defined and what's foreseen. And then there's a structural or procedural conflict of interest, of course. The last incoming documents will be checked by whoever is responsible for performing PPD, or personal data redaction. So you need to be aware that there's a situation is very likely to occur where these people are the last ones to do their job before the submission can go out. And you don't want to run into the situation that those people are then the ones to be blamed if the submission deadline is not met. So that's a situation that you need to address with organizational measures or whatever, because this might bring these people into a very uncomfortable situation. Let me put it this way. Next slide, please. Another learning from our redaction activities is that even though stakeholders were trained on the criteria for what may constitute CCI, the learning here is that it's not sufficient to just train them. You have to, at least for some of these people, you really need to enter into discussions once they have made their first proposals, challenge why this might not, or this may constitute over-redaction, or why this is not following the criteria, because that's where people start to learn and think. Otherwise, there's a high risk, I would say, for over-redaction. And then we encountered a couple, and these are just the major worst examples, a couple of technical issues. First one was that from e-sign documents, creating or recreating editable PDF versions of e-sign documents, it turned out that this procedure blows up the file size. So for larger documents, this was not feasible in our case. So we had to find workarounds here. And then we also had a repeated problem. This was then we had several people go into a PDF that was placed on a network share drive, do their markings of what they believe is CCI, and then they just saved it, and then other people would go into the file and put their markings in there. And this ended up a couple of times in the file being corrupted such that it could not be opened again. We don't know why this happened. Talking to other colleagues in other companies, I learned that we were not the only ones who experienced this. So I thought this might be we could share this experience. Then speaking with the CRO who did the Part 2 documents in our case. We realized from the learnings, from the experience, that when it comes to PPD reductions, it's a common phenomenon, I would say, that people think of, if the working instruction says it should be redacted, then I do it, and if it's not mentioned there, then I should not redact it. I should retain it. And this turned out to be a mindset that was not very helpful. So we really need to move to redact any personal data unless it's required not to be redacted. That's the move we need to make next time. And then a big surprise for many people involved, both at our end as well as at the CRO, that files contain, in many cases, metadata, personal data, the names, for example, of author names in documents. And this applies even in templates provided on Eurolex Volume 10. This was a rather big surprise. Next slide. So I would say, talking also with people in other companies, I tend to say that CROs will likely claim that they have CTIS experience, which may be true, but certainly not to the entire teams. But don't rely. That would be my recommendation. Don't rely on such a statement. You may end up, as a sponsor, you may end up doing training of the CTR and CTIS of CRO staff to some extent. Something that I mentioned earlier, need to understand the whole picture. CROs usually, from my experience, usually are very, very, they are more special. The people there are more specialized in certain functions than we are as a sponsor organization, at least, as a small sponsor organization. So they have very specialized tasks to do, often on a local level. So it's even more difficult, or it's even more important, that as many people as possible have a broader picture, a broader understanding of the implications. If you do something, what does this mean in the future? Versus, if I don't do this, what does it mean? So I have no golden solution for this, but at least I think you should be aware that this is it was used to be in the past. Sponsor, again, my recommendation would be not to assume that there's a clear understanding of what constitutes personal data and what needs to be redacted. And also don't assume that the CRO's SOPs or working instructions for redactions are fit for purpose. So my recommendation would be to double check. Next slide. So a few surprises and experiences from our first submission. Timelines. I'm not going to go into detail, but just to give you a flavor of, what you might experience, or what we experienced. We expected 25 days, assuming that we would, for the validation procedure, assuming that we would receive at least one RFI. We ended up with 63 days, of which there was this a couple of 2 to 3 weeks clock stop over Christmas and New Year, but the rest of the difference we were not able to trace back in terms of calculating the number of days it took. So this is what we got and what we had to expect. Another detail, when looking into CTIS in the conclusion section, and I embedded a screenshot here. It said under conclusion, it said valid, but it has no validation date. So we were not really sure whether our submission was now validated or was not yet validated. And when we asked the reporting member state, they told us that they cannot see this window or this view that we have, but it's not validated yet. So I believe it's a misleading display of the status of the study. But so, yeah. A learning here is also that the reporting member state should be able to clarify if you contact them via email. Next slide, please. How I'm doing time-wise. Yeah. Not entirely unexpected, but still it's something that you have to deal with. Requests from member states for information documents that are not required per regulation or per the Q&A document. And some of examples I'm listing here: CVs of sub-investigators, for example, patient-facing materials for use after enrollment, or one member state or ethics committee in this case requested confirmation that trial sites have SOPs in place, including process description of the PI specific task. So a very, very detailed request without, at least not to my knowledge, without any legal basis. An important take-home message here also is the communication with member states concerned regarding RFIs on part 2. So there's these central contact points of the member states that we all know, but there's it does not work in all the states or the member states as you would expect as a sponsor, because from one member state, for example, replied back that saying that we should contact the ethics committee because they are the ones, but we don't know the ethics committee. So we replied back to the member state asking for contact details of the ethics committee, and then never heard back. Others were not responding at all. So hopefully this will also be a learning for these central contact points, that they need to realize that they're at the core, they're the relay, the connection point. They need to make the link between the sponsors and ethics committees in this case. Next slide. The assessment part reports of part 2. We saw, we only had 5 countries, but we saw many errors and inconsistencies in these reports. Happy to share more details offline, of course. You know, just to give you a flavor, content listed in the report was not consistent with the protocol or with our entries in CTIS. This leads to the question, you know, what exactly is then approved if the assessment report states something that is not in line with what's been submitted. Another surprise would have been in one country that they attached the list of the voting members of the ethics committee along with full name and signatures and they only had this for publication version. So one report from country A contained a list of approved sites of the wrong country. And then we tried to reach out to these member states and ask for a corrected report. In some cases, we did not receive any response at all. In one case, they sent us a corrected report via email, but have not yet replaced it in CTIS so far. Next slide. And that's my last one. So from a practical point of view, these are the 3 main pain points, I would say, for us. Diverging country-specific requirements. It's hard to get hold of any complete list of what is required locally. Then member states requesting documents or information without a legal basis or even against the Q&A document. And then the extensive, I would say, country-specific language requirements, even for CTIS data field entries. I mean, there's also a practical issue to this because you know, how do you do the translations then? It's not a document; it's just entries. Anyway, time is over. This is the last slide. I'm handing over to Reiko to share her experience from a large organization.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And here, the presentation is supposed to focus on the best practices for a successful transition of clinical trials from the old directive to the EU CTR. I'm just starting with few slides that are both applicable for transition, but also for the adoption for any new application. Next slide. So the big difference, we have a lot of differences with Matthias' situation, but also a lot of similarities. So in a big company, the big challenge to implement the EU CTR is the size of the organization. The organization is divided in multiple departments that are highly specialized and fairly independent. Moving this large organization from one model to another is not easy. So we needed a common agreement on how and when we were going to do this. That was important for us to establish an adoption and transition strategy. The strategy was to answer questions like by when will the company start using the clinical trial regulation and not the directive, by the first day of the transitional period or from the first day of the mandatory use of CTR, for example. Were we going to use the full 3 years of transition to transition our trials, or we will only transition trials at the end of the transitional period during 2024, for example. So all these questions needed to be answered up front. So we could work then on the timing, evolving all the complex network of global and local processes to align with these new requirements and workflows, and work on a training and communication plan. The training and communication is not a one-time activity, as Matthias was saying, but a plan that takes consideration of the adoption and transition strategies and acknowledges that in this, at least in this large organization, we were competing for people's attention. So a lot of things are going on, a lot of initiatives, a lot of projects, and EU CTR sometimes is only one more of those activities. So we really are competing for people attention and to keep them focused or to give the priority it needs. And we also deal with an elevated number of people, and there is a certain people turnover, that so you need to keep all this moving and it's not static. So we are continuously updating training and communications as we learn. This is a similarity with what Matthias was sharing. So we have dedicated lessons learned sessions, and we have installed a hypercare model that supports each of the individual studies that are going through the new processes and workflows with EU CTR. So there is a number of individuals that represent each of the key study roles involved in a clinical trial application that are not study specific. They support across the portfolio, so they are gaining insights and learnings very quickly, and then they can share this with the rest of the organization. So it's very, very important for us to keep this model, and it's helping us to learn quickly. But as I was saying, we need to continuously update training and communications as we learn and as the external environment, the Q&As are being released or updated. Next slide. Sharing some statistics, I'm calling it. So some of the learners we had in terms of the new clinical trial applications through the system. We are seeing that the overall timelines for end-to-end process from submission to approval are at the maximum end of 106 days or longer. This is the longer dates are due to several, we are seeing several issues. Due dates are during weekend or during member states' national holidays. So the due date is on the next working day. This is making the periods longer than expected, and also due to the winter clock stop applied for some of the trials. But overall, we are always working at the maximum end of each of the periods. So for validation, the RFIs are received at the maximum timeline, so day 45 or longer from validation. They are giving us maximum turnaround times for responding to questions. Normally the 12 days is respected, and so on. There is a subtle effort or trend to synchronize Part 2 RFIs with Part 1 RFIs, giving us a chance to implement any of the changes or to align the ICFs with any of the changes that are due to a protocol review during Part 1 RFIs. But it's not always the case, and this is causing a lot of problems for us and other sponsors, I would guess. And also, it is not rare to receive 2 rounds of RFIs, both for Part 1 and Part 2s. So it is something we are still not sure. We will only receive 1 RFI for the moment. I think countries will get better to it, but for the moment, it is not rare, and you should expect perhaps to receive 2 RFIs or more. Next slide. So here is one of the examples on how we had to evolve our organization to align with the new workflows that were imposed by the regulation. Since we have now a single point of entry for the submissions and all the relevant communications, then we had to use an existing central team for this activity with expanding their responsibilities. So this existing central team was centralizing the compilation of the core dossier and then dispatching to each of the local affiliates for them to submit either to health authorities or ethics committees. Once dispatched to the countries, the timelines for submissions were agreed at country level with the global teams. It was not a holistic submission date agreed throughout Europe. Now, this central team is also, with the expanded responsibilities, responsible of the CTIS overall and of the Part 1 completion, although Part 2 remains locally managed. But this is how we evolved our existing organization. So for the CTIS training, we leveraged completely the training provided by the EMA with no internal training developed specific. What we had in place or have in place is a pyramidal approach to training, with starting with a master trainer, super users, and then cascading down to the organization. Next slide. Another big change, as I was saying, for the clinical trial application process, the first big change is agreeing the right submission date, which requires this strategic thinking of Part 1 versus Part 2 readiness. As I was saying before, each country was managing their own submission timelines depending on the resources or the prioritization they were given to the trial. Now we all have to agree on what is the submission date in Europe, all the countries. And there is a lot of thinking on whether the best submission date is as soon as Part 1 is ready. So you could use an Article 11 all Part 2 delays, or whether we want all the countries 100% Part 2s completed before we perform this submission. So this is very strategic thinking that have operational impact. One, because the CTIS is not fully equipped already or developed to deal with Article 11 fully. If we use Article 11, we may encounter problems down the line. And also it will depend on what is your target for Europe. Is having first patient first visit earlier, or you want to have the maximum recruiting power as early as possible, so um, you will be maybe wanting to submit all the part twos in parallel. One of the things that are pushing our submission timelines today is due to the latest Q&A updates, where we are seeing that the questionnaires that are linked to endpoints that are now required in part 1 and not in part 2 as patient-facing material, and it was the situation before under CTD and national legislation. The questionnaires, even if linked to the endpoints, were considered a part 2, or sorry, an ethics committee documentation, patient-facing material. And now with the regulation and the Q&A, it is considered part 1 material. But with the development of the Q&A and the local annex, the local language, is mandated to have those questionnaires translated into local language for submission, which is delaying the entire submission. Then something that it was unexpected and still trying to figure out how to best deal with this is that this misalignment of the ICF, the approved ICF after the initial application is completed, is not aligned with the approved protocol. Why? Because the part 1 RFIs were coming later than the part 2 RFIs. So when updating the protocol, due to RFIs, if there is any impact on the ICF, we didn't have any opportunity to update the ICFs and still have them approved within the same process. The part 2s were either closed or were approaching so fast that we were unable to provide both responses in a timely on the same timelines. Therefore, as a consequence, there is immediately after the initial approval, there is a substantial modification part 2 that needs to be programmed or submitted to align the ICF with the approved protocol. And this is extending the startup timelines considerably. And then for this type of reasons, further submission needs for the trials are easily put at risk, because it's not rare that you are already planning for the next submission after initial approval. You may have an IB annual update coming round the corner, or you were waiting for the initial approval to be in place to submit a CMC amendment. In those cases, this unexpected substantial modification part 2 may also delay, or you will need to find the right balance on when the sequence of submissions that you intend to do. Next slide. Another big change, and it is mostly for the 12 days RFIs, is on the protocol and associated documents. So we are incorporating local requirements in a global protocol, so we are making use of the appendix. This is highly recommendable. As Matthias was saying, the identification of reduction is done in parallel with the authoring. Those processes are interlinked now. It is not a two-steps approach. You start the identification of reduction after the protocol is final, but you do both of them in parallel. As a matter of fact, we had to make some decisions, and we opt out for having a EU CTR compliant synopsis as a separate document, since the synopsis within the protocol is very extensive, is much more detailed than what is recommended on the Q&A about the EU CTR synopsis for the protocol, and their intended purpose is very, very different. So we weren't unable to adapt the current protocol synopsis within the protocol document itself, we weren't unable to adapt it and make it EU CTR compliant. So we opt out to have a separate document which has this increased maintenance associated to it. So there's one more document we need to maintain, upload, and no redactions are expected on the synopsis. This is one of the, if you keep it short to the 2 pages maximum as is recommended, it is certainly achievable. Then we have the this 12 days turnaround time to respond to any query, and that includes the updated of uh, any document that is impacted. And for protocols, that is a big deal. There is no there was not a fast track process for a protocol amendment. Any protocol update, even if due to a health authority query, was considered a protocol amendment, and it is a lengthy process from proposing the changes to the protocol, going through the internal processes, and getting a final published document. So all this within the 12 days, it was seriously compromised. So we did a deep dive into all the processes that are needed and connected to have this protocol amendment done, and we were taken out of the critical path and non-essential steps. So keep it to the essential, what is needed. Then one practical tip, this is in the Q&A, the regulation Q&A, track changes documents is not uploaded for publication. They are only uploaded in the not for publication slot. It was already agreed internally as a company before it was in the Q&A. And lately, we have seen the Q&A related to the how to keep company confidential information in CTIS, and there is a recommendation for sponsors that we can upload documents with redactions identified, redactions highlighted, or in a red box, for example. So the assessors, it's clear for the assessors what information cannot be released in any of the assessment reports, for example. So we tested this approach already in one of our trials and on several of our trials, but in one of them, this is causing problems with assessors. We are receiving questions because this they cannot copy paste from the documents. So if you are intending to have this approach, maybe you need to upload 3 separate documents, the redacted one, redactions highlighted, and the completely clean one, which is multiplying the number of uploads and the number of metadata clean. You have to do renaming and so on of documents. So it is a decision to make. And we can go to next slide. Now I'm getting into the current challenges with transitions. So the big challenge with transitions is that is continuously changing the external information, the external environment. The Q&A versions are continuously giving us new information, different information that it is making very difficult for us to adapt as quickly. There is this new latest question 11.9, which is saying that the full alignment with EU CTR requirements should be done before the end of the transitional period. So we were all agreeing that transition was a 2 steps process. First step, a administrative transition with what you already have approved. And a second step, when you will align your dossier with EU CTR at the next substantial modification. But we were under the assumption that this next substantial modification for aligning the dossier with EU CTR was at any time. And now this question is bringing this as a precise deadline, which is 30th of January 2025. This is totally unexpected. Companies like the BMS, we have a high number of trials to transition. Only going through the administrative transition is asking us 3 months of preparation for compiling the currently approved dossier and going through all the checks on the protocol and all the submitted information we have today. So this is already requesting 3 months of preparation. Then there is the submission period. Then we have this waiting period of time until the transition application is decided, until we have the approval. So it is making very difficult for in our situation to still fit the substantial modification needed to align the transition trial with the EU CTR within these timelines of 30th of January 2025. There are more than 1,000 trials to transition across industry. Those numbers were gathered through FPIA out of 26 surveyed companies. The total was appalling, more than 1,000 trials to transition, but the ranges are very different. The ranges start at 3. So this is, some companies have 3 trials to transition, but some other companies have up to 150 trials to transition. So this is putting those companies in a very different situation when you only have 3 trials to transition or more than 100. The other challenge with transition is not only internal or due external evolution of the information, is also how member states and mostly ethics committee understand the transition and how they are responding to a transition application. We have seen not only validation RFIs, but we have seen assessment RFIs. While it was totally clear in the Q&A that we were transitioning, and in our cover letter, that we were transitioning already approved documentation and the dossier shouldn't go through any review. The only review or the only questions we were expecting was about reductions. Indeed, reductions was the only new element introduced to any clinical trial dossier with the exercise of transition. So the rest is already approved documentation. So it was highly unexpected, and we have been pushing back to some of the requests and mostly successful. Also, just to bear in mind that some of those questions came up because depending on the internal organization of each country, the ethics committee may change. The ethics committee evaluating the trial may change as you transition. So the ethics committee is allocated either randomly or by any other decision, but it's not rare that the ethics committee is a new ethics committee, and therefore some of the questions were intended to retrieve the old dossier, the old approval letters, and so on. So we thought it was a consequence of this change of ethics committees. Next slide. So as I was saying, it was important for us to have a transition strategy. It was due to the high number of trials in the eligible for transition. We decided to use fully the 3 years as allowed to transition our trials. We also needed to define what the criteria to make an ongoing trial eligible for transition was, and we agree with the Q&A that keep transitioning trials to the minimum number possible. So we were in the transition book of work. What we have in the pipeline are trials that have a last patient, last visit planned beyond the transitional period end. So we are not transition any trial. That's only because we prefer the CTR legal framework or any other request. So it is only the ones that we have to. And so we ended up with a very nice plan. We built a bell-shaped distribution. So the intention was to start with a few trials to transition during the first year, increasing the number on the second year, keeping it somehow steady, and then be able to, at the end of the year 2024, just be transitioning a low number of trials. That was allowing us to plan the workload for any of the supporting functions, because as I was saying, there is a lot of departments involved in the clinical trial applications and application of a transition. So having this image, this picture, this plan in place is helping all the supporting functions to to plan their workload and resource needs. It's also a tool, a way to keep control of the transition. So when we can define what are the maximum number of trials we want to transition in a given quarter or in a given year, and send alarms to say whether to the organization whether we are on track or whether we are not on track on the target for transition. And also having this end tail that is slowing down the number, it was a way to be able to include any late transitioner that it was not initially planned, but it was added onto the transition book of work later on. Imagine you had to extend your last patient last visit date because you had some recruitment problems, unforeseen recruitment problems. So all the dates were extending. Those trials could still be allocated in the late as a late transitioners. We have a motto today: do not shift but swap, because many study teams were requesting for a shift on their transition dates, giving priority to other submissions, sometimes a protocol amendment, sometimes other type of submission, and we're asking to shift their transition dates. So what we are saying today is we don't shift, but we swap. We want to keep our numbers under control. As I said, there is a 3-month period only for preparing the transition application. The timelines from submission to approval are improving. We are starting last year, and the couple of trials we submitted for transition, we started at 78 days from submission to approval, and we are already down to 48, and I've seen one today, 40 days overall. So they are getting down those turnaround times, which is helping us going through the process. And the trend as well really is to receive validation RFIs and do not receive any assessment RFIs. So this is, I think, is the proof that countries are learning as well, and they are getting better. Next slide. Then there is one slide on protocol consolidation harmonization exercise. Maybe I can keep it for the questions, but you really need to do this exercise if you have country-specific versions of the protocol, or in the scope are any country addendum or country amendment, that you need to clearly spell the differences. You need to appoint a reference protocol and use the CTFG best guidance guide to outline if any of those differences are substantial, and either consolidate or harmonize your protocol. This is driven by the type of difference, and we are now creating an EU version of the protocol. So the remaining country specificities are in an appendix. And if you end up harmonizing the protocol, that will require a submission under CTD for any of the deltas, and that is adding 1 to 3 months to your transition timelines. I think that was my last slide.
Okay, thanks, Rika. So, in the interest of time, we would like to go to the questions now. Matthias, if we can also have you on the camera, please.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So, okay, so there are certain questions. So first question is for Rekal. When receiving two rounds of RFIs, is it two rounds from the same countries, or rather than some countries sent to RFIs later? If the second round of RFIs come from the same countries, is it based on the responses the sponsor submitted or completely separate RFIs?
Hmm. Thanks for the question. So we've seen when the second round of questions comes out of the validation step, we think those are late countries that are late responding to their task of what are their validation issues. So the reporting member state is issuing a second RFI to send us those late requests for validation. When they are part of an assessment, again, it may be because some countries are late in their task to provide the review, the considerations for the part one. And on the part two, we've seen this as a response to our queries, as well as also too late. mm, a new question they didn't have for the first round ready. So both.
Mhm. So, Matthias, one question for you. How are you managing local translations, central of affiliates?
Local translations, we use the CRO that also is responsible for Part 2 documents.
Mhm.
They have their own people or use a vendor, both.
Okay, thanks, Matthias. So then there is another question for Rekal. For transitional trials, does the sponsor need to upload all EU CTR required documents into CTIS at the time of transition?
Mhm. Yes, the answer is yes. But if you don't have those documents, so there are the essential documents that you have them approved because they were also part of a CTD application.
Mhm.
Those you have to upload them at the time. Then there are documents that you may not have them as essential documents. So then you are allowed to upload a blank document with an statement saying that this document was not required under CTD, so you are not uploading it. And this statement, we started with a very generic statement, just saying this is a blank document, and we were asked to be specific, which document is replacing and why this document. So be careful with this. I don't know whether the member states now are being more being less peckish, but in the beginning they wanted even the statement on the blank documents to be specific,
Mhm.
and they are asking to be as complete as possible.
Mhm.
So if you have documents that are not the part of the essential transition documents as per Q&A, but you still have them, please upload them instead of a blank document.
Okay. Then again, there is a couple of more questions on transition trials. Do consolidated protocol not require submissions under CTD first? Second is there any assignment of the trial phase, trial category? And then can the disclosure transition trial be postponed or this can be deferred?
So one question at the time for
Okay.
transition.
First one is consolidated protocol. Does it require submission under CTD first?
No, a consolidated protocol, you don't have to submit under the national legislation first. You move on into transition directly. Mhm.
Mhm. Okay. And the last question is, do you have a member of the disclosure team participate on the project teams regarding to provide inputs on requirements and timelines? Are CTIS timelines included in the Gantt chart? So it is for you, Rekul.
Mhm.
Yeah, that if you have a member of the disclosure team participate on the project teams regarding to provide inputs on requirements and timelines,
Mhm.
and if CTIS timelines were included in the Gantt chart.
We don't have a disclosure team member part of the project team, but we keep them informed and they give us feedback, but they are not part of the team for a submission. Mhm.
Okay. So that was all we had. So thanks to all the participant and those who joined the our webinar today. Thanks to our speakers as well, Rekul and Matthias. Thanks very much. It is a very insightful presentation you gave, and we learned quite a lot. So thank you so much, everyone. There are certain questions we have not been able to take on due to lack of time, but yes, definitely you will receive responses over email. We will take these, and please submit your feedback. So that would be very important to us for anything that you have felt or if you want to ask. So there would be a form in the link. So just please complete that feedback form. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Good
Thank you.
luck.
Thank you.